The views expressed by participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the producers, sponsors, or promoters of this production or their affiliates. Washington University in St. Louis does not directly endorse advertisers' products or services.
I'm Liberty Vittert, and this is Amended, my guide to the First Amendment. Freedom of the press sounds like one of those big, untouchable American ideals, like democracy, cheeseburgers, and yelling at strangers on the internet. But today, the fundamentals behind freedom of the press are in question, in part because the very definition of who we consider, quote, the press, isn't always clear. Honestly, in 2026, anyone with a smartphone and a Substack or YouTube channel can call themselves a journalist. Sometimes these citizen journalists produce groundbreaking, cutting-edge reporting, and sometimes not so much. Now, I need to pause here because much of what we're going to talk about in this episode is directly related to activities that people in places like LA, Chicago, and Minneapolis engaged in during ICE mobilizations there in 2025 and early 2026. This podcast was always intended to help you, the audience, understand the evolution of the First Amendment from the 18th century to today. Somewhat ironically, I am not a journalist, and Amended is not and was never intended to be a journalistic examination of current events. So while we won't be talking about the most recent events, our hope is that this podcast will give you a clear context for understanding the news as it happens. Prior to 2025, independent citizen journalism played a significant role in a number of cases, such as the killings of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 and George Floyd in 2020. But in Fort Bend, Texas, just outside of Houston, independent journalist Justin Pulliam continues to test the limits of what press freedom really looks like on the ground. Justin's been practicing journalism since college when he worked on his university newspaper. Today, he has his own website where he covers community stories and the kind of hyper-local reporting that has nearly disappeared with the slow death of traditional newspapers and media.
So I post stories about what's happening in my community to both highlight what's going on, highlight misconduct, and to show people how they can make a difference. What's awesome about this country and our Constitution is that everyone can report the news.
Beyond covering city council meetings and local criminal trials, he also covers, most notably, police activity. So whereas most of us try to avoid encounters with the police, Justin runs towards them.
I use a police scanner. The county has a website where they show some of the calls. And then a big part of it is just when you're out and about and you see the police and you feel comfortable filming from a safe distance. It's something everyone can do. I am trying to document and show the public how the police are precisely carrying out their duties.
But even though he's usually just watching and observing, not directly inserting himself into the action, it doesn't always go as planned. The police, understandably, sometimes react aggressively to his presence or demand he stand someplace where he can't actually film what's happening, like behind a car that blocks his view.
So very frequently, I have to assert my rights to be able to film the police. And it's always a situation because a lot of officers don't like citizens challenging their authority, but they're overstepping their authority when they prevent you from being able to exercise your First Amendment right to film.
As you might imagine, his relationship with law enforcement in his town is dicey, to say the least. And in December 2021, things came to a head.
My wife and I were driving to the Brazoria County Courthouse to work on a story about jury tampering. And on the way there, we saw that the police were responding to the residence of a mentally ill man where the police had responded before at very large police responses with rifles out, that sort of thing. So I was very concerned about his safety. I immediately went to his mother, who was there, and asked her permission to film for his safety. Would you like me to film for his safety or not?
Yes, but I don't want this in papers and everything
I'm not
else.
going to put it on paper. I'm watching the deputies, not your family member, okay?
Okay.
He filmed for a few minutes, and then a police sergeant arrived on the scene, and he was really not in the mood for Justin and his sidekick camera.
As soon as he got out of his vehicle, he walked towards me and instructed me to leave to go across the street.
Although there were several other people there, the officer asked only Justin to move away from the scene. Let's listen to the exchange because, naturally, Justin was filming it.
I need you to go across the street. I need y'all to go ahead and go across the street, please.
Across the street?
Yes, across the street.
So you can shoot him?
What's wrong with you, man?
What's wrong with you?
Please go across the street.
So is everyone leaving or just me?
Across the street.
Everyone or just
5,
me?
4.
Oh, yeah,
3,
you're gonna be like that?
2, 1. Come here.
You're crazy.
Thank you.
Justin continued to ask the sergeant why he was being singled out, but
The sergeant didn't answer. Instead, he raised up his fist and charged towards me, counting down from 5, and arrested me as I was walking backwards towards the street.
Justin was charged with a misdemeanor for, quote, interfering with an officer's public duties.
They seized my equipment, my cameras, my memory cards. They still have that equipment to this day.
Justin went to trial in 2023, where all but one juror voted to acquit. But because of that one holdout, it was deemed a mistrial. And in 2024, prosecutors decided to drop the charge. But now Justin is back in court, and this time he's the plaintiff.
At the end of 2022, I sued Fort Bend County and the deputies who were involved in these incidents. So one would have been my First and 14th Amendment rights. We're first asking for the court to make a ruling that says that what the police did was wrong, that you have the First Amendment right to film the deputies. And then we're also asking for monetary damages as well. My status as a social media journalist does not reduce my First Amendment rights. I have just as much right as the institutional press to cover a press conference or matters of public interest that are occurring in public. And it's not just about me. It's about establishing more legal precedent that everyone, no matter your status, no matter your viewpoint, can record the government, can record the police. We, under the First and 14th Amendments, we have a right to film the police, to question the police, to be critical, and to publish that, and that people should not be retaliated against or stifled for doing that.
So like we saw with freedom of speech and freedom of religion, freedom of the press sounds pretty straightforward, but legally it is anything but. Justin's case highlights two important questions that courts return to again and again. First, in an era where everyone has a friend with a podcast or a relative with a Substack, who gets to call themselves the press? And second, if that definition is expanded to accommodate your Substack or friend, should they be afforded the same legal protections as, say, a New York Times or a Wall Street Journal reporter? And it's important to note some of these Substack writers or journalists have a bigger circulation than either one of these publications. If we start defining podcasters like me as the press, are there legal standards that we should be held to? And what are those standards and who decides them? Obviously, 2026 America is not the same America as of our founding fathers. It's not even the same America as it was 2 decades ago or even a year ago. Our relationship with our rights are different today and are evolving in real time. We'll return to the question of citizen journalists later in the episode, but first, we need to examine the ways government can and does place limits on the press. We're going to dive into 3 important cases, one in the Supreme Court, one in federal court, and one in civil court. These cases will help to explain how the legal landscape might be shifting in ways that could change journalism and freedom of the press forever. Let me introduce you to David Einrich, an award-winning investigative journalist now based in New York. David had a really formative experience while working in London in the 2010s that really showed him how important the First Amendment is to a free press in the United States.
I moved to London in 2010, and I was there for like 6 or 7 years. And, you know, the UK does not have the First Amendment. And as soon as I got there, I realized that the First Amendment matters because we would get people, or the government in some cases, would go to court to get injunctions against us reporting about stuff. Sometimes we wouldn't even be allowed to disclose the existence of an injunction. And I started to kind of recognize how much more difficult it is to operate as a journalist when you do not live or work in a country that has the First Amendment.
Here's something you may not know. The U.S. actually gives the press stronger legal protections than most Western democracies. In fact, a British judge threatened David with jail time in 2013 if he revealed key names linked to a sweeping international fraud scandal involving major banks and rigged interest rates. But thanks in large part to a landmark Supreme Court case in the 1960s involving the very newspaper David works for, that couldn't happen here in the United States.
So New York Times versus Sullivan is a case that the Supreme Court decided in 1964. It starts 4 years earlier in 1960 when a group of supporters of Martin Luther King took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. It documented this litany of abuses that Southern officials were perpetrating against civil rights activists. And the gist of the ad was completely true. There was like terrible, violent tactics being used against civil rights protesters, but some of the particulars in the ad were either wrong or exaggerated.
Some of the mistakes were small, but specific, like claiming that student protesters in Montgomery, Alabama had been padlocked inside their university cafeteria. They weren't technically padlocked in, just trapped inside by police and unable to leave, which, still isn't great legally speaking.
So it was basically overstating just how draconian some of these actions were, but it was minor in the grand scheme of things because there was no dispute that the police were using and encouraging violent tactics against demonstrators and doing things like allowing the dogs to go run wild and draw blood on protesters before the police intervened to stop things, allowing the Ku Klux Klan to come in and beat up protesters before the police would intervene to stop it. And one of the people who saw the ad was a guy named L.B. Sullivan, who was a police commissioner in Alabama.
And Commissioner Sullivan decided to do something about it.
And Sullivan, who was not named in the ad, filed a libel lawsuit against the New York Times, saying his reputation had been damaged because the New York Times published this ad and the ad had some details wrong.
Now, if you're thinking, wait, this guy wasn't even named in the ad. How does this hurt his reputation? Is there maybe something else going on here? Congratulations, dear listener. You are asking all the right questions.
This is at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, where the New York Times northern papers were covering what was going on in the South.
That's James Goodall, a man who served as both vice president and legal counsel for the New York Times.
And the South came up with a solution to deal with the bad stories. They would sue. So there were all sorts of politicians in the South who sued media companies.
It was not about seeking kind of reparations for damages that they had actually faced. They were weaponizing the law to achieve political aims that were supposed to suppress people's rights and suppress people's speech.
And it worked. Lawsuits were filed against major TV networks, and during the Sullivan case, the New York Times actually changed its practices.
And the Times' lawyers instructed journalists not to write about institutional racism in the South because they were so worried about the legal risks associated with doing so.
And Sullivan filed his libel case in Alabama, which was, let's say, pretty friendly to this kind of lawsuit.
It went to court in a courtroom presided over by a judge who celebrated the Confederacy. The jurors were all white. Some of them showed up wearing Confederate battle costumes in court. And you will not be surprised to hear that the verdict was swift and strongly against the New York Times and in favor of L.B. Sullivan. And the jury said that the New York Times had to pay Sullivan $500,000 in damages, which doesn't sound like a whole lot of money today. But at the time, the New York Times was a much smaller place, and it really put the institution in financial jeopardy.
We did the math. That would be about $5.2 million in today's dollars. So the Times appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court and lost, which meant their last and only option was to take their fight to the Supreme Court. Attorney Roland Nachman, working for Sullivan, felt really good about his odds.
And there was no question that the allegations were false. And when I left for Washington, I said that the only way I could lose that case was for the Supreme Court to change the law of libel.
Oral arguments for the case were held in early January 1964.
New York Times Company petitioner versus L.B. Sullivan.
Herbert Weschler argued for the Times, and he pointed to some of the historical writings of James Madison, one of the architects of the First Amendment, arguing that the very point of the First Amendment was to protect the press from some of the very types of lawsuits that were common in colonial America.
The First Amendment was precisely designed to do away with seditious libel. And seditious libel was punishment for criticism of the government and criticism of officials. I believe that if James were alive today, that the submission that I am making was the submission he would make.
Roland Nachman's defense was simple. Libel is libel. Newspapers shouldn't get treatment, and the press doesn't deserve extra legal protection.
This is within the normal, usual rubric and framework of libel. It charges them with criminal offenses. The charges would certainly hold them up to contempt and ridicule and disapproval, and we think we're well within the classic definition of libel.
And while both sides felt pretty good about their chances, the Supreme Court decision was decisive. Once again, James Goodall.
And so what the Supreme Court did is says, you can't have that kind of suits. And it was 9-0 decisions.
And what they said is that in order for a public figure or a public official, someone like L.B. Sullivan, to win a defamation case, they needed to prove a couple things. First, and most obviously, they needed to prove that someone had said something false about them and that falsehood had hurt their reputation.
The Supreme Court went further. They introduced what is now known as the actual malice standard. It says that it's not enough for a publication to get something wrong to bring a suit. You have to be able to prove that the publisher or outlet knew the information was wrong, but published it anyway.
And that was a high bar that was designed to make it much harder for powerful people and powerful institutions to win defamation suits. And the Supreme Court said that high bar was really necessary because we as a country prized vigorous debate about kind of public issues of the day. And if someone is worried that if they slip up and get a fact wrong or make some sort of innocent mistake in the course of having that vigorous debate, it's going to have a really profound chilling effect and lead people and journalists and members of the public to really and kind of rein themselves in and censor themselves. And the Supreme Court thought that was completely contrary to the spirit of the First Amendment. And so they created this very high bar that made it much harder, and in some cases impossible, for public figures to prevail in these types of lawsuits.
This ruling didn't just protect the New York Times. It helped pave the way for some of the most important reporting to happen over the next decade, ranging from the Vietnam War to the investigative journalism that exposed the Watergate scandal that brought down President Nixon.
And so New York Times versus Sullivan had this profound effect in terms of liberalizing debate and empowering everyone, whether you're a journalist or not, to speak critically and fearlessly about people and institutions that hold power over you in your country and in your community. It led to this golden age of investigative journalism, where all of a sudden reporters and news organizations felt empowered to go look into the affairs of the country's and in some cases the world's most powerful people.
The libel laws were made effectively in the Sullivan case by the Supreme Court.
Once again, former New York Times General Counsel James Goodall.
The legislature can't change the libel laws, so only the Supreme Court can change the laws, and it doesn't look like they will.
But what if there's a workaround to Times v. Sullivan? What if someone could still use the legal system to pressure or even stop media outlets from publishing? New York Times versus Sullivan set a really important precedent, giving journalists strong protections against libel claims. But in the 21st century, we've seen a rise in a different kind of legal pressure aimed at stifling press freedom.
Largely under the radar, there has been a huge increase in the use of litigation and in some cases just legal threats against journalists working at small community newspapers and also journalists who are independent, maybe someone with a Substack newsletter or a podcast.
There's actually a term for this, SLAPP suits. That stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. The goal with these lawsuits isn't always to win in court. The real goal here is intimidation. When big-pocketed plaintiffs go after smaller journalists or outlets, they know they have a financial advantage and are really betting on that imbalance to scare people into silence. So some people see these lawsuits as a sneaky way to undermine press freedom, using fear and intimidation to push outlets into killing a story or settling rather than fighting it out in court. Others see them very differently, as long overdue accountability and a way for people to fight back against media that they believe is biased or has caused real harm. And lately, some of the biggest legal challenges are coming from the most powerful men in the world.
Elon Musk is becoming well known for his use of SLAPP, strategic lawsuits against public participation lawsuits, which are essentially intimidation lawsuits meant to silence critics like Imran.
Former President Donald Trump is suing CBS News for $10 billion over what he is claiming was deceitful doctoring of an interview with Harris.
One of the most famous SLAPP suit cases has it all. Celebrity scandal, a leaked sex tape, and a mysterious tech billionaire quietly funding it from the shadows. This is Gawker v. Bollea, better known as Gawker versus Hulk Hogan. Once again, New York Times reporter David Einrich.
Gawker was a website, really a network of websites that was very irreverent and saucy and gossipy and loved holding powerful people, not only holding them to account, but loved kind of taking them down a peg. They seemed kind of out of control and wild and irresponsible at times.
To Gawker's founder, Nick Denton, gossip was important. To him, it was even something of a philosophy.
Gossip is the version of news that the authorities or the celebrities or the officials don't want people to know. It's the unauthorized version.
And even before the Hogan lawsuit, Gawker was infamous for their unorthodox reporting and boundary pushing. That included what they called the Gawker Stalker Map, which was, well, exactly what it sounds like. It tracked celebrity sightings in real time. Here's former Gawker reporter Emily Gould explaining it to Jimmy Kimmel.
The Gawker Stalker Map tells you where celebrities have been sighted in New York City at any given time. So you can sort of scroll around and see, Jude Law was shopping for condoms at the Duane Reade in Midtown, or,
So if people are out and they have their cell phones, they can send a little message to you and say, I just saw Gwyneth Paltrow at the movies. And that way, when Gwyneth Paltrow comes out of the movies, there can be at least a dozen psychopaths waiting for her.
As you can probably tell, Kimmel was not exactly a fan.
I just want you to think about your life and weigh your options. And because I would hate to see you arriving in hell and somebody sending a text message saying, guess who's here?
But Gawker was also doing some very important accountability journalism. For example, Gawker was one of the first outlets reporting on figures like convicted sex offenders Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein, way, way before they were headlines in mainstream media.
And they had many targets over the years of people that thought that they should not be in the public spotlight, and Gawker would drag them kicking and screaming into the public spotlight and often take pleasure in humiliating them.
And one of those people Gawker targeted was arguably the most famous wrestler of all time.
Weighing 321 pounds from Venice Beach, California, the fabulous Hulk Hogan.
Born Terry Bollea in 1953, Hulk Hogan debuted in 1979 and quickly became the face of pro wrestling in the 1980s. The Hulkster dominated in and out of the ring, popping up all over pop culture, including on late-night talk shows.
I'm looking at the size of your arms. I don't believe this. I wish I had anything that big.
How about your bank account?
And in movies.
Well, I was wrestling in Madison Square Garden, and I got a note from the promoter to call Sylvester Stallone for a major part in a Rocky movie.
Right.
I mean, if there is a Mount Rushmore of wrestling, Hulk Hogan would definitely be carved into it. In Reagan-era America, Hulk Hogan came to represent more than just a wrestler. He was essentially a symbol of America's strength and bravado. Here's Terry Bollea describing the persona Hulk Hogan created.
The character's larger than life. It's the all-American character. Even my theme song is Fight for the Rights of Every Man. He's the all-American hero.
And this sort of impossible to ignore persona was exactly the kind of celebrity that Gawker could not resist writing about.
Gawker published a sex video of Hulk Hogan having sex with his best friend's wife.
Gawker broke the story in 2013. Hogan's best friend was a shock jock radio personality known as Bubba the Love Sponge, a former Howard Stern satellite radio host who was known for outrageous on-air antics like claiming to slaughter a pig on live radio.
You want to skin the hog? Yeah, we're going to make sure we skin the hog. We're going to put it on the grill.
As you might imagine, a secretly recorded video of a celebrity as big as Hogan sleeping with his best friend's wife made for a wildly popular post. Hulk Hogan was not happy, so he sued Gawker for invasion of privacy.
The former pro wrestling superstar is suing the website Gawker for $100 million.
Hogan, whose real name is Terry Bollea, claims Gawker ruined his life. Hogan told the jury Bubba was his best friend, and the release of the tape devastated him.
In the 2016 trial, Hogan argued that publishing this tape violated his privacy and caused significant emotional distress. Unsurprisingly, it led to some very surreal moments in the courtroom, often feeling more like theater than law. I mean, it combined sex, cuckolding, and one of the most famous wrestlers in the country.
Intimate details were revealed today in the Hulk Hogan trial. On the stand today, Hogan admitted he lied about the size of his manhood in past radio interviews.
Do you have any doubt, as you sit in that witness stand today, that you were discussing the length of your penis on Bubba's radio program? Any doubt?
Well, it's not mine, because mine isn't that size, but we were discussing the length of Hulk Hogan's. I do not have a 10-inch penis. No, I do not. Seriously.
Fair enough.
Gawker claimed that since Hogan was a public figure, he had forfeited his right to privacy. Once again, here's Nick Denton, Gawker's founder.
We published snippets of a sex tape to accompany a story about this famous wrestler who had talked a lot about his sex life. We thought it was a valid story. We still think it is. A federal judge deemed it newsworthy, and we believe the appeals court will find the same.
And of course, Terry Bollea, aka Hulk Hogan, had a different opinion. Here's his lawyer, Charles Harder.
This had nothing to do with political speech, freedom of ideas, freedom of words. It had to do with invading Terry Bollea's privacy for the most base of reasons, which was greed.
In the end, things didn't go Gawker's way, as David explains.
And the jury returned a huge verdict against Gawker and for Hulk Hogan that very swiftly led to Gawker having to declare bankruptcy.
So the verdict, and specifically the $140 million in damages Gawker had to pay, shut down the site for good. But I hear you. This sounds like a pretty cut and dry case of privacy infringement. But what does it have to do with slap suits and freedom of the press? Well, it turns out there was a lot more to this story.
As you may remember, Hulk Hogan recently won a lawsuit against a website that posted a secretly recorded sex video of the pro wrestler. Now it turns out Hogan had a heavyweight in his corner for the courtroom match, one who was rich and motivated. Here's John Blackstone.
Behind the high-profile court case of Hulk Hogan versus the gossip website Gawker was a secret. Hogan, whose real name is Terry Bollea, got nearly $10 million to pay for his legal team from Silicon Valley billionaire Peter Thiel.
That's billionaire and Silicon Valley royalty Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal and Palantir Technologies.
Thiel confirmed last week that he secretly spent about $10 million bankrolling lawsuits against Gawker. In one of them, a jury awarded retired pro wrestler Hulk Hogan $140 million.
Hulk Hogan's legal team was financed by millions and millions of dollars of secret money that allowed them to roll out this very potent legal strategy that essentially guaranteed Gawker's demise, not based on the merit of their case, but based on the strength of their lawyering. And so I think a lot of people in the media and proponents of the First Amendment were kind of horrified by this because it showed, whether you liked Gawker's mode of journalism or not, it showed that a single individual, if they had enough money and patience and kind of craftiness, could destroy a news organization or a media company that they didn't like.
Why would someone like Peter Thiel, a billionaire technocrat, care about an aging professional wrestler's sex tape? Well, he also happens to be a gay man who had been outed by Gawker years earlier, so his personal grievances with the outlet ran deep.
Thiel, a founder of PayPal and an early Facebook investor, was targeted by Gawker in a 2007 posting that outed him as gay. Thiel's support helped Hogan win the $140 million award that could now put Gawker out of business. It is also raising concern that money from Thiel and others like him could silence free speech.
Thiel insists that he was not motivated by personal animus.
This is not about the First Amendment. It is about the most egregious violation of privacy imaginable, publishing a sex tape surreptitiously filmed in the privacy of someone's bedroom. And to hide behind the First Amendment, behind journalism, that is an insult to journalists.
One would imagine, and one would understand, as do I, why Peter Thiel would really hate Gawker.
They were a singularly sociopathic bully. My view is that other journalists, other media organizations were not remotely in the same ballpark.
Thiel claims he stayed behind the scenes so that the case could be judged on its legal merits rather than be dismissed as a billionaire trying to silence an independent media outlet. But in the years since, the case has become a symbol of exactly that fear.
Hulk Hogan's victory against Gawker and the effect that that had on Gawker led to it was one of the factors that led to a real proliferation in the use of libel lawsuits against news organizations. It's not the only one by any stretch of the imagination, but it was a really important one because it showed just how potent this kind of weaponized litigation could be in destroying news organizations. But what I found in my reporting is that the dynamic began to change in 2016 when Donald Trump came onto the stage. And politicians from both parties for a long time have made popular sport of bashing the media. Trump, as he was wont to do in many walks of life, took this to an additional extreme and elevated media bashing into something where he was using at times violent language.
I feel I have to do this. I shouldn't really be the one to do it, but we have to straighten out the press. Our press is very corrupt.
And also embraced very early on a call to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan to make it easier for people like him to sue and to prevail in court against news organizations.
Remember that New York Times v. Sullivan case established the actual malice standard, which for a long time was successful at protecting journalism from chilling legal threats by requiring plaintiffs to show that the press knowingly published false information. Perhaps no one has called for the overturn of that standard louder or more often than Donald Trump.
I'm going to open up our libel laws so when they write purposely negative and horrible and false articles, we can sue them and win lots of money. We're going to open up those libel laws so that when the New York Times writes a hit piece, which is a total disgrace, or when the Washington Post, which is there for other reasons, writes a hit piece, we can sue them and win money instead of having no chance of winning because they're totally protected.
While slap suits have been around for a while, what Trump is calling for is a more fundamental change, namely changing the law and revisiting the Times v. Sullivan case we heard about earlier in this episode.
And that was, I think, really kind of the starter's pistol being fired in what has become a nearly decade-long effort to narrow or overturn Sullivan. And the cause has been taken up by a fairly wide range of people. So you have people like Trump and his allies on the political stage who think that overturning New York Times versus Sullivan would make it easier for them to not only win defamation suits, but also to intimidate news organizations and get them to abandon lines of coverage or lines of investigation that might expose wrongdoing by them. There are a bunch of political activists around the country who have taken up this cause under claiming that New York Times versus Sullivan was decided incorrectly in the first place.
House Bill 991, Governor Ron DeSantis and his allies are pushing the anti-defamation bill to rein in what they and their supporters see as media excesses. One First Amendment advocate says if passed in Florida, it will be the, quote, death to public discourse. And it's not just legacy or mainstream media in the crosshairs. Your critical blog post or a scathing social media post could be too.
HB 991 would effectively lower the bar on defamation lawsuits so that it would be with greater ease that public officials would be able to sue critics of public policy, of their way of governing, of their choice of clothing, whatever the case.
And increasingly, you have a number of Republican-appointed judges who have embraced this argument. And there are a bunch of federal and state judges around the country who have expressed their support for overturning New York Times versus Sullivan, which, of course, only the Supreme Court can do.
And that's significant because while only the Supreme Court can overturn New York Times v. Sullivan, when judges across the country start questioning a precedent or openly rooting for that outcome, it's usually a sign that something bigger is brewing.
U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas sent shockwaves through the legal and media worlds this week when he said the court should revisit one of its landmark decisions about freedom of the press. It's the 1964 case, New York Times versus Sullivan. Thomas said the court should reconsider the landmark ruling.
Despite concerns about ulterior political or financial motives behind some of the criticism, Heinrich says that not all opposition to Times v. Sullivan comes from bad faith.
I think there are some lawyers and intellectuals out there who have a kind of a more good faith argument here, which is that there are lots of cases where the media or other individuals get facts wrong and damage someone's reputation. And it can be very hard to prevail in defamation cases when that happens.
For now, only 2 Supreme Court justices, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, have publicly suggested revisiting Times v. Sullivan. But it no longer feels as untouchable as it once did. And what happens next could shape how freely journalists are able to report some of the most important stories of our incredibly eventful time. And for that matter, could change the ability of people to take retribution, or as I would call it, justice, against outlets that have wronged them. So far, we've learned how the First Amendment protects the press from lawsuits and how that protection is being questioned in the 21st century. But there's an even bigger question facing the freedom of the press in the 21st century, because the technology of today looks nothing like the technology of 1791, the year the First Amendment was ratified. As I pointed out at the start of the episode, anyone today, like citizen journalist Justin Pulliam, can publish, record, and broadcast what they see and hear to the world, using only a device that they carry in their pocket. So what does freedom of the press even mean when potentially everyone is the press? To answer that, let's go back to one of the first cases to tackle that question head on. A case about recording the police, not with a smartphone, but with a good old-fashioned flip phone.
1, 2, 3, go!
The date is October 1st, 2007. Simon Glick, an idealist immigrant from Russia and a newly minted lawyer in Massachusetts, has just finished a job interview with the Boston DA's office. Having graduated first in his law school class, he's feeling very optimistic about his future. After the interview, he takes a walk through Boston Common, the oldest public park in the country, on the way to meet his wife. That's when he notices something so troubling that it stops him in his tracks. Here he is telling the story in his own words.
I turned around and I saw a young man being arrested by 3 police officers. I saw that one of the police officers was choking the young man, and without really giving it that much thought, I took out my cell phone and started recording.
At first, the officers didn't seem to mind, likely because they assumed he was just taking pictures.
One of the officers told me that I had enough pictures and it was time for me to move along. When I said that I saw one of the officers punch him, I was asked if my cell phone recorded audio, and when I answered yes, I was immediately arrested.
And then the officer arrested him and charged him under the Massachusetts wiretap law, and also charged him for disturbing the peace and for aiding the escape of a prisoner.
That's David Milton, a lawyer who later joined Simon Glick's legal team.
And, the Massachusetts wiretap law prohibits secret recording of audio. And the case was dismissed in criminal court because the judge said this wasn't secret. It was on Boston Common, and said, this wasn't disturbing the peace. Just because the officers weren't happy they were being recorded didn't mean that they could, shut down Simon exercising his First Amendment right.
Remember, Simon wasn't just any bystander. He was a lawyer. So unfortunately, the Boston Police Department picked the wrong private citizen to mess with.
Simon filed a citizen's complaint with the Boston Police.
He reported the incident to the police department's Internal Affairs Division, assuming they'd want to look into the allegations of these officers using excessive force. But that assumption, it turns out, was optimistic.
They blew him off, and so nothing happened. And so Simon then went to the Massachusetts ACLU, and they approached the office where I worked.
Simon was really frustrated that the department showed no interest in investigating their own. So he decided a lawsuit would be the only way to get some accountability.
And we filed a lawsuit in federal court in Boston alleging that the arrest violated Simon's rights under the First Amendment and under the Fourth Amendment. The First Amendment, of course, protects freedom of the press, and the Fourth Amendment protects against unlawful arrests. So the city of Boston and the officers filed a motion to dismiss the case under the doctrine of qualified immunity.
Quick sidebar, qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that sets a high bar for suing government officials, including police officers, for violations of civil and constitutional rights. It is not a total get-out-of-jail-free card, but for a plaintiff to win, they have to prove that the officer should have reasonably known they were breaking the law. We'll cover this in detail in a future season of Amended. So despite this legal hurdle, Simon, the ACLU, and his legal team felt strongly that this case was important and needed to go to trial.
Simon, he was very interested in getting recognition that his rights were violated, but he was also very interested in making sure that it was very important to establish precedent. And the district court thought it was obvious and easy enough. He didn't even bother to write an opinion. He just ruled from the bench, just orally in court. It showed in this case some level of, this is an easy one.
In other words, the judge concluded that the officers should have known that Simon was within his rights. And just because he was using relatively new technology, a phone capable of recording audio and video, it did not make his actions any less protected. But the case wasn't over.
In Boston this morning, federal appeals court will hear a case involving whether there's a right to openly record police conduct. The lawsuit stems from a 2007 Boston Common arrest.
And once again, the courts came down firmly on Simon's side.
Last Friday, the U.S. First Circuit Court of Appeals issued a ruling that affirmed, stronger than ever, the rights of individuals to openly record the actions of police officers.
This time, the court didn't just issue a bench ruling. They issued a detailed opinion that was really a sort of rousing defense of Simon Glick's actions. Judge Kermit Lipez, writing the unanimous opinion, emphasized that gathering information about government officials sits at the heart of First Amendment protections.
Gathering information about government officials in a form that can readily be disseminated to others serves a cardinal First Amendment interest in protecting and promoting the free discussion of governmental affairs. Changes in technology and society have made the lines between private citizens and journalists exceedingly difficult to draw. Such developments make clear why the news-gathering protections of the First Amendment cannot turn on professional credentials or status.
The message was heard loud and clear. The First Amendment's free press protections do not depend on credentials or job titles. And after this strongly worded court opinion, the outcome was swift and clear.
The city of Boston has settled a landmark lawsuit involving a man who used a cell phone to videotape an arrest by Boston police. In the settlement of the civil rights suit, the city will pay Simon Glick, a Boston attorney, $170,000 for damages and legal fees.
And just like Simon hoped, this case helped establish a precedent for the smartphone era. Sometimes all you need is a flip phone and perseverance to protect our First Amendment rights. While this case helped establish the right to film the police, the boundaries of this right are still being debated and contested today. In places like LA, Chicago, and Minneapolis, the details of these rights, where you can stand, what officers can demand, and how recording might affect public safety, are being worked out in real time, often leading to very serious and even deadly altercations between bystanders and law enforcement. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about a very different and more viral aspect of the freedom of press debate. It's one you may have stumbled upon on YouTube or TikTok, and it's a little messier and a little weirder and possibly even absurd. To some people, it's extremely annoying, but to others, it's also deeply important.
People who consider themselves to be citizen journalists exercising their First Amendment rights by filming others in public areas, often at government buildings, to hold public servants accountable. Pismo Beach police told me they received a lot of calls about the group filming people going in and out of the post office on Monday.
They call themselves First Amendment Auditors, self-appointed citizen journalists who deliberately test the limits of their First Amendment rights by filming in public spaces, often at government buildings and public places, in order to hold power accountable.
A lot of residents come to the DeLand Police Department here and walk into that lobby through those doors to speak to an officer about a crime or file a report. Now, lately, the police say these First Amendment auditors have been walking in after those residents and recording that initial conversation, many of which is posted online.
So let's go straight to the source and speak to one of these First Amendment auditors directly.
So my name is Mike Norton, and I've got a YouTube channel called KULT News with my lovely wife, Stacy, and we are what is commonly referred to as First Amendment auditors. And we basically take pictures and videos in public and in publicly accessible places. Anything from public sidewalks to City Hall, to government buildings,
I asked you to move a long time ago.
Public sidewalks.
Yeah, I know you are.
It's not harassment. You're public sidewalk.
No, you're harassing people inside. They're scared of you being outside taking photos.
Not against the law.
But you,
not against the law.
Disorderly conduct is because I asked you to leave.
Whether it's supporters who see his work as essential or viewers at home who hate watch his confrontations, Mike's content gets a lot of traffic.
This year, we'll probably have 20 million people will see us on YouTube. I would say on average, in an average month, we probably do, probably 20 audits a month. And I would say of the 20 audits that we do per month, I would say police are called on us probably 19 out of 20 times. And when the police show up, I would say about 95% of the time, the police recognize our right to take photos and videos in public. They recognize the rights of the free press. The other 5% of the time, though, they get it woefully wrong.
And when officers get it woefully wrong, the consequences can be severe. And yet, because Norton knows his rights, he feels emboldened to film in places most people wouldn't even think to pull out a camera.
If you're in public, if you're in a place where the public is welcome, you can absolutely take photos in that place, whether you're in line at the DMV, whether you're in line in the post office. Probably one of the most common ones is the post office, where people will say, this is a federal building, you can't take pictures in here. Well, I mean, we're going to be in Washington, D.C. this next week, and I assure you, you absolutely can take photos in federal buildings, unless it's specifically, prohibited. Like, you can't go in and film the Supreme Court in action, perhaps, but you can certainly film your local postal employees in the post office from the lobby.
Legally speaking, Mike isn't wrong. Courts have consistently ruled that people have a First Amendment right to record in public spaces, as long as it doesn't interfere with official duties or present a security risk. For Mike, that makes almost anywhere a potential target for an audit.
You'd be amazed at how many times I've seen that, where a bank will have a computer monitor facing their window, and their window is 2 feet from the public sidewalk. And you can walk by and read everything on the computer monitor, and they're mad at me for aiming a camera at them. It's like, I think your customer should be mad that you have a computer monitor facing the public sidewalk and revealing all this confidential information to the public.
To many, maybe even most people, these auditors seem more like harassers or provocateurs than watchdogs. But if you ask Mike Norton and others in the movement, they'll tell you they're defending the freedoms we hold dear, loudly, visibly, and certainly often.
Like I said, rights are like muscles. If you do not exercise them, you will lose them. And it's really heartwarming to be in a city or in a state that I've never been to in my entire life, and have a complete stranger pull his car over and know me by name and want to get a picture with me because they're so excited because they watch us on YouTube all the time.
Ultimately, what makes Mike's work so interesting is it really stress tests the Constitution itself, forcing us to rethink what counts as journalism.
We've had people say, oh, you're not a journalist. Well, I guess you'd have to ask yourself what the definition of a journalist is. And I have no doubt if Benjamin Franklin were alive today, he would be a YouTuber, and he would be using YouTube to spread his message. Now, I would hardly compare myself to Edward G. Robinson or Woodward and Bernstein, but what we do is, I think it's necessary. When we stress test the First Amendment, and I think it's important to have people with cameras and microphones going into public buildings and recording our public servants.
Not everyone agrees, and some states have been making laws aimed at cutting down on First Amendment auditors and others who film the police, like a new law in Florida.
Senate Bill 184 is waiting for the governor's signature right now. It would make it a crime to ignore a first responder's warning not to approach or remain within 25 feet of that responder if interfering with their work.
Senate Bill 184, it goes into effect January 1st. It prohibits a person from approaching first responders after receiving a warning to back away. Now, anyone found violating that law could face time behind bars.
Senate Bill 184 will shield first responders from unwanted visitors or aggressors, prohibiting anyone from coming within 25 feet of a first responder after being warned on scene.
You shouldn't be in a situation where you're at a traffic stop, you're responding to a call of someone in distress, and then you have people come trying to interdict or trying to harass you from performing your duty. You know, we view that as a problem, and now you're going to be held accountable.
That last voice was Ron DeSantis, current governor of Florida. But of course, like most laws, the devil is in the details. And it's not hard to imagine how a policy like this could be used against journalists like Justin Pulliam, the local reporter we heard from at the beginning of this episode who runs his own website and covers a lot of community-level news, or Simon Glick, or auditors like Mike Norton. Look, I've at times found myself on very different sides of this issue. I've written stories that were unfairly targeted, where politicians accused me of lying and tried to pressure social media platforms or the news organizations I write for to take my work down. My brother is a journalist, and I've watched my family and people I love become targets of attention-seeking opportunists who hide behind the First Amendment while causing real harm. And that's what makes this conversation so difficult, because when it becomes personal, it can be really hard to stand purely on legal principles. It's not abstract anymore. It's messy and it's uncomfortable. So I guess it really comes down to one very hard question. Which risk is worse? Is it living in a world where bad or biased journalists sometimes get it wrong, sometimes really wrong, and hurt people in the process? Or is it living in a world without a truly free press, where governments and powerful actors are able to spin everything, control the narrative, rewrite reality, and shape society and public opinion without being challenged? For me, the answer is clear. The greater danger is a society without a free press, because that is a society that is much more vulnerable than an imperfect, even messy one. History shows us what happens when we start limiting speech in the name of protection. In the UK, for example, where First Amendment rights are not legally enshrined, recent reports show police making dozens of arrests every day for, quote, offensive online communications under vague standards like causing annoyance, inconvenience, or even anxiety. Can you imagine being arrested for a social media post that annoys someone? I mean, think about it. That's the road we risk going down if we don't fight to protect our First Amendment rights, like freedom of the press. And that's a road I'm not willing to take. In the next episode of Amended, we're going to cover a First Amendment right that last made big news with Nazis in the 1970s, but is now being displayed and debated on TV screens and the internet every day. The right of the people to peaceably assemble. This podcast was made possible through a grant from the Frick Initiative at Washington University in St. Louis. Richard Fawal and Liberty Vittert are executive producers. Noam Osband is senior producer, Susanna Casisa is producer, and Trevor Hook is assistant producer. This podcast was written by Noam Osband, Olivia Jampol, Liberty Vittert, Susanna Casisa, and Richard Fawal. Audio engineers are Ismael Valderas Wong and Jonathan DeLeon. Sound design and original music composition by Ismael Valderas Wong. Stephanie DeLeon-Sick and Susanna Casisa did archival research, and Laura Krebs was our finance director.
Topica.